prevented from taking on Putin. Russia's top opposition figure is found guilty of embezzlement. Did Alexei Navalny get a fair trial? Also ahead, island occupation, protests at Okinawa in Japan as work begins on a new American airbase. I'm Imran Garda, and this is The Newsmakers. He's been called the man Vladimir Putin fears most. Alexei Navalny is seen as Russia's most credible opponent to the president, and he may have just been blocked from running against him in next year's elections. A Russian court has found the anti-corruption campaigner guilty of embezzlement in a retrial of a case from 2013. The verdict was almost identical to the first, which the European Court of Human Rights overturned, calling it arbitrary and unfair. Navalny's supporters say the trial is the latest attempt to keep him out of politics. Our newsmaker today is Alexei Navalny, as we ask if the verdict will end his bid to challenge Putin's rule or galvanize his support.
He's a blogger and an activist who rose to prominence during the 2012 anti-government protests in Moscow. 40-year-old Alexei Navalny has built his career on exposing corruption. He's released a documentary targeting Kremlin officials. And last year, he set his sights on the presidency. But Navalny himself has also become the focus of corruption allegations. In 2013, a regional court found Navalny guilty of embezzling a state timber company. 3 years later, the European Court of Human Rights overturned the verdict, saying he was tried unfairly. Russia's Supreme Court then ordered a retrial. This week, the regional court upheld the original sentence. On Twitter, Navalny accused judges of ignoring the European Court's ruling by reissuing the same verdict. He says his trial is politically motivated.
They are afraid of our campaign. They're afraid of me too, and maybe even not just me, but any candidate who tells the truth.
Though only a fringe candidate, Navalny was seen as one of the only viable challengers to face President Vladimir Putin in next year's elections. Other opposition figures have also fallen. Boris Nemtsov, a close friend of Navalny, was shot dead in 2015. Vladimir Kara-Murza is in coma after a suspected poisoning. Navalny's supporters say his trial could galvanize momentum for the opposition, although Putin's popularity remains far higher in the polls. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Russian affairs analyst Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the publisher and editor of Politics First magazine. And from Moscow, Oleg Kozlovsky. He's a pro-democracy activist and an anti-corruption campaigner and heads up the Vision of Tomorrow Center. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Marcus, let's start with you. Did the man receive a fair trial?
Yes, he did receive a fair trial, but unfortunately that is not the way it's been portrayed by Western media. It has to be said that there is a misconception about Alexei Navalny, and that is largely on account of Western media. Mr. Navalny is not a prominent opposition leader. Indeed, I wouldn't use the term opposition leader for him because his party has no representation whatsoever in either the lower or upper house of the Russian parliament. The only two prominent opposition leaders in Russia today is Gennady Zyuganov, the leader of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia. Mr. Navalny does not have support amongst ordinary Russians. Indeed, if we want to talk about support, it is simply negligible. However, Western media is portraying him as some sort of credible opposition leader who is a threat.
All right, let's pose that to Oleg then.
That's not the case.
Okay, so Oleg, Marcus saying this man is not a credible opposition leader. He has no support.
Well, I was surprised to hear Mr. Papadopoulos' opinion because it's literally what the Russian government media is saying here, but the problem is there is no way to tell exactly how popular Mr. Navalny is, because he was almost never allowed to participate in elections. His party, which Mr. Papadopoulos correctly said is not represented in the parliament, was denied registration for technical reasons several times because obviously the regime didn't want Mr. Navalny to run for the State Duma, and this is why he is not in the parliament. And the only time when he actually participated in elections in 2013, in the Moscow mayor election, which is one of the major election campaigns in Russia, he took second place, even though he had no media access. He won 27% of the vote, which was much more than all the other parties, including Zyuganov's party, Zhirinovsky's party, that Mr. Papadopoulos has cited, took combined. He
Oleg, let me ask you
was
bluntly,
on the second to the Putin's.
Oleg, let me jump in here and ask you bluntly, do you truly believe, sincerely believe, that he was silenced because he is an active, tangible threat, political threat to President Vladimir Putin?
I think that we don't know at the moment how many votes he can get, but Putin, as a person with, as you know, KGB training, he used to think about his threats in advance, and he wants to deal with these threats before they get too big to be dealt with. So in this sense, he is smart. I mean, Putin is acting smart because he is not even allowing Navalny to test this system.
Okay, so let's take that.
Sense,
let's take that and pose it to Marcus. Sure, let's take that and pose it to Marcus. Marcus, do you accept the skepticism? Let's, put aside. You're very unhappy with the Western media. Let's put that aside for a moment. Park it off. Do you accept the skepticism when there seems to be a history of Russia making political threats go away? And so when you look at Anna Litvinenko, Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya, Boris Nemtsov, these people actually lost their lives. And here maybe Alexei Navalny maybe just loses his credibility or loses the ability to run for president. Do you accept why people are skeptical? Because anytime there seems to be a political threat, they somehow go away in Russia.
Well, I understand why some people may be skeptical, because they are largely influenced by Western media. However, we need to approach the cases you've just cited, for example, Anna Politkovskaya, as a court of law would. There is no credible evidence to suggest that the Kremlin had, or President Putin indeed, had any hand in those acts whatsoever. I am prepared to state that Mr. Navalny had his day. He did have some support in 2011 and 2012, and that was mainly amongst young Russians and largely in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But that really was it. Yes, he's a charismatic speaker. Yes, he's a handsome individual, but he's never put forward a serious, credible program for Russia, and that is why his support is so negligent.
Yeah, but Marcus, Oleg is saying he's never been given the opportunity to do that, and the opportunity would have been to run for president in 2018.
Yes, because he and his party have never met the threshold required to actually enter elections, because their support is so negligible. I would also add this as well, that Mr. Navalny, like Mr. Nemtsov, who you've just cited, have built up some quite dubious dealings. And unfortunately, once you enter into dubious business dealings, all sorts can happen. And we do have to have faith in the Russian legal system. We mustn't be patronizing towards the Russian legal system. We mustn't be condescending.
So let me take that and throw it to Oleg. So Oleg, the judge said, Judge Alexei Vichurin said that Navalny organized the crime and was acting out of profit motives. Tell me, Oleg, why you don't trust the judge or the legal system today?
Well, I have first-hand experience with Russian legal system, and I'm afraid it maybe has some system in it, but there is nothing legal in it. And in all political cases, judges always either have direct instructions what to do, or they know what they expected to do. In this case, in Navalny's case, we know that the European Court for Human Rights has reviewed his case carefully for 3 years,
yes,
and
Oleg,
it
you do
ruled
have to back that up with
that
evidence
there is
to
no
say that the
ground
judges are told what to do.
to accuse Navalny of any crime. And now we have literally word by word the same sentence done all over again, with all the same proceedings. Nothing has changed. No additional opportunity for Navalny to bring his case, to make his case. And if you looked in detail at how it happened, it just has nothing to do with real court proceedings, except there is a person calling himself a judge, and there are people calling themselves prosecutors, because almost every motion by the defendants was denied. Almost every motion by prosecutors was accepted.
Oleg, let me ask you, if the legal system's so heavily tarnished, why is Navalny even bothering to appeal? He said he wants to appeal, he says he wants to fight, so is it going to be a waste of his time?
Well, in a way, it is a waste of his time, but there are also some legal things that need to be considered. For instance, if he doesn't appeal, he cannot go again to the European Court for Human Rights. So he has to appeal, and most likely we expect that the appeal will be denied, of course, because it is a Russian court again, and then he will go to Strasbourg, where his case will be reviewed once again, and hopefully it will be done in a quicker way that will allow him to run for president. There is a chance in it. And also, the verdict doesn't come into legal force until an appeal has been reviewed.
Okay.
So Navalny will appeal, and
let's get Marcus in. Marcus
it
wants to
hasn't come
jump
into
in.
force, he can run for president.
Okay, Marcus?
Yes, Imran, I think it's really important for me to add this into the discussion, because you're not going to hear Oleg say this, and you're not going to hear Western journalists say this. Navalny is not a liberal. He's not a moderate as he is portrayed in the West. He's actually a Russian chauvinist. He's actually a Russian nationalist who has made some very, very disparaging remarks about non-Russians. And quite frankly, that poses a threat to the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. He has participated in numerous ultra-nationalist rallies and conferences in Russia, which has nothing to do with being moderate, which has nothing to do
so you
with
made,
liberalism.
you made a bunch of accusations there. Oleg, you know the man personally. Is he a chauvinist and an ultra-nationalist?
No, well, I've known Navalny for more than 10 years. At one point, he did communicate a lot with nationalists, and he did participate in several nationalist rallies, but it was about 10 years ago. At that time, many people believed that there could be a union or a kind of coalition between the liberal wing of the opposition and the nationalist wing of the opposition. But unfortunately, the nationalists in Russia took another turn. And if you look at the Russian political landscape, you will see that the biggest nationalists are, in fact, those who support the Kremlin. Putin, who actually annexed a part of another country and invaded a neighboring country because he said he wanted to protect Russians abroad. Or if you mention Zyuganov or Zhirinovsky, Zyuganov is well known as a Russian nationalist, an anti-Semite, and a lot of his party members, they are just openly xenophobic. Zhirinovsky is a guy who made himself a reputation of the Russian nationalist. So if you compare Navalny to everybody in the political landscape of Russia, except maybe a few very liberal
has Mr. Navalny expressed regret for the
he's much
racist
more liberal
comments
than
he
the
made
rest.
about people from the Caucasus?
Oleg, did he make racist comments about people in the Caucasus?
Well, I know that Navalny, for instance, probably what you can
Yes
refer
or no?
to as
Answer the
nationalism,
question, yes
he
or
calls
no?
for the end of subsidizing of Chechnya from the Russian federal budget.
Oh, what he said is-
This
okay,
money
but that
are
can be,
taken by
it's up to interpretation
Ramzan
as to
Kadyrov.
whether that's racist or not. Marcus, let me ask you, because we are running out of time, however this came about, you believe the man got a fair trial. Oleg does not believe he got a fair trial. However this came about, is this going to breathe new life into the opposition in Russia? And isn't that a good thing, Marcus? Pluralistic democracy?
No, I do not believe it will do whatsoever, because as I said, Mr. Navalny and his party have negligible support amongst Russians. The opposition parties in Russia are the Communist Party and the Liberal Democratic Party. And quite frankly, Mr. Navalny's views do not correspond with the vast majority of Russians. Mr. Navalny expresses quite a lot of pro-Western sentiment, and that is up against how ordinary Russians feel. So Mr. Navalny's conviction will not breathe life into either
And
him
then let me pose that
or
to
his
Oleg for the
party.
final word. Oleg, is this going to unify you guys as the opposition and energize you?
Yes, I hope so, because Navalny has a good record of galvanizing support for him and motivating people to volunteer in his campaigns.
Okay, gentlemen, Marcus Papadopoulos and Oleg Kozlovsky, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you very much. Okinawa in Japan is one of America's most important military outposts overseas. US forces have been stationed there since the end of World War II. But people have been campaigning for decades for those troops to leave. And this week, their calls grew louder as work on a new base began. Natalie Perhonen reports.
In Okinawa, the elderly volunteer for the front line in a show of pacifist resistance against US military installations on their island home. Okinawa is a 3-hour flight from Tokyo, a subtropical paradise in the East China Sea. It makes up less than 1% of Japan's landmass, but it houses more than 50% of the roughly 50,000 US troops stationed in the country. And these latest protests have sprung up over the relocation of the Futenma Air Base to an area near Camp Schwab. The airbase is in a densely populated area, but the decision to move it to the island's east coast, to Henoko Bay, has been a source of contention for environmentalists and anti-US activists. They say the frequent military exercises disrupt island life and are a constant reminder of a US occupation. The Japanese government says there is no alternative.
辺野古移設が唯一の解決策である。このことについては変わりありませんし、長年日米間で真摯に議論してきた上の合意であり。
Tokyo was on the itinerary of US Defense Secretary James Mattis's first overseas trip.
The alliance between the United States and Japan is enduring and will remain as the cornerstone of peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region.
And Okinawa is at the heart of that relationship. The military installations on the island are the US front line in East Asia, close to the Korean Peninsula and the East and South China Seas. The US has tried to reassure residents. Last year, the Americans handed a large tract of what was once military land back to the Japanese. And they say they'll relocate some of the troops to Guam. But Okinawans say they are unfairly carrying the burden for the nation and paying a high price. Last year, there were protests after a 20-year-old, Rina Shimabukuro, was raped and murdered by a former US Marine turned contractor. Okinawa's governor, Takeshi Onaga, has called for the removal of all troops and has support from large sections of the community. But is there any resolution which would put local concerns ahead of strategic interests? Natalie Pohjonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Sydney is Miyume Tanji. She's an expert on US-Japan relations with the Australian National University and is also the author of Myth, Protest and Struggle in Okinawa. And from the US state of Alabama, Walter Given. He's a retired Major General of the US Air Force and a Senior Vice Chancellor at Troy University. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, Walter Given. There are many on the islands and those from the outside who see the US troop presence there as a sort of relic of a post-World War II era that is irrelevant these days. How would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think it's irrelevant. I think this is one of the most enduring alliances that we've had in our history, and it's a strategic alliance that really responds to the security needs of Japan and of other of our allies in the Pacific. Bases are tremendously important to that alliance. This is a very strategic location for us. But of course, this is a two-way street. We work with Japan, and Japan's government has decided that this is where the base should be. And we're working with them to make that a reality.
Miyume Tanji, the Japanese government says there is no alternative. Are they wrong?
Yes, yes, yeah, they are wrong. The Japanese government probably has taken a lot of effort to make it sound like it is the only alternative. Through a lot of storytelling and manipulation of images, but it could be built anywhere in mainland Japan. That's the biggest reason the Okinawan people are protesting. One of the biggest reasons. It's because it is made to believe that it is the only alternative where it's not. And I mean, there are other places which makes more sense strategically as well. The argument that the Okinawa is strategically the best place is not quite right.
Right. And I want to address that.
It will make the most vulnerable.
Allow me to jump in just for a second. I want to address that right at the very end in terms of strategic location and some of the threats in the region. Let me go back to Walter Given now for a moment and ask about the symbolism of the protests. As an American, when you see thousands of Japanese, thousands of locals on the island protesting, saying we don't want the United States here, particularly the symbolism after last year, after a 20-year-old woman was raped and murdered by a contractor, but who was a former Marine. How damaging is all of that, in your eyes, to the image of the United States? And does it not give you the idea that at some point in time the United States is going to have to leave because the Japanese government is going to start to listen to the people of Okinawa?
Well, I've been a base commander. I've also been part of presences overseas. We always try to be as sensitive as we can to the local population. It's terrible when something like that happens, and I can guarantee you that the commanders have taken strong action to try to remedy that. We also abide by what we call a status of forces agreement with the host country, which clearly delineates all of our responsibilities. And beyond that, we constantly work to try to mitigate some of the things like noise, for example, that goes with aircraft operations. Because we are sensitive to what the local population is thinking and feeling. And so I see the protests, and I welcome their ability and their freedom to do that. I'm sure that we are working as closely as we can with the authorities in Japan and in Okinawa to address the issues. But we get, again, let me go back to this. It's not just about being someplace, it's about what you get by being there. And we've talked about some of the security challenges in this area, but one of the great things that you get by the training that was alluded to earlier is the ability to work side by side with our allies in the very place that we may have to work together. And of course, our Japanese allies also come to the United States and train at our bases. For example, I was the commander of Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we hosted our Japanese allies there for exercises that they would have had a more difficult time doing in Japan.
And Major, looking at President Donald Trump, he's still getting his feet under the table. But just a second, ma'am. Just a second. I just want to ask Walter Given, looking at President Trump, less than a month in office, along with General Mattis, how do you foresee them approaching the Japanese? Is it going to be too different to Barack Obama's approach?
Well, I can speak to General Mattis. I've served with General Mattis. I have the greatest respect and admiration for General Mattis. He's got a very good strategic sense for this region. And everything that I have heard General Mattis say and do so far is right in line with enduring interests, not just for the United States, but enduring interest of Japan and our allies in this region.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mehmet Tanji, final word to you. The United States says, hey, we've got an unpredictable situation with China, the tensions in the South China Sea, North Korea is unpredictable, and it is nuclear. There are issues over Taiwan. We need to have some sort of military presence in the region. Do you accept that? Do you accept that the United States needs to be there?
The Okinawan people do not want to accept the presence there. They want it to be somewhere in mainland Japan, and I think that's fair.
Okay. Dr. Mehmet Tanji and Major General Walter D. Given, it's been a pleasure having both of you on the program.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry we have run out of time. Good to have you. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.